Thank you for joining us for this sermon podcast from United Christian Church of Austin, where no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're invited and welcome. This sermon from February 8th, 2015 is entitled Give and Take. It's a reflection on a reading from the New Testament, from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 1, verses 29 through 39. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to learn more about our open and affirming ministry at United Christian Church, simply head over to our website, www.uccaustin.org. Thank you.
Our first reading today comes from the New Testament, from the Gospels, from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 1, verses 29 through 39. May God take these words and make from them a holy word for us today. As soon as Jesus and his first disciples left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. Friends, God is still speaking to the world. May our hearts be open to listen and to respond. Amen.
So last week, when we came to the sermon, we had the dramatic story of Jesus confronting an evil spirit and casting it out of a man who was possessed, right there in the midst of the synagogue, in the midst of the worshiping community on the Sabbath, no less, in front of God and everyone. Well, this week, the only dramatic thing in our reading, continuing in the Gospel according to Mark, is the dramatic shift in setting and tone. Jesus and those first disciples, Simon, who will later be called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James and his brother John, together they leave the synagogue and leave the wider public arena to visit the home of Simon and his mother-in-law, and presumably his wife and children, and his brother too. In contrast to the high drama of the morning's events, it's hard to imagine a more domestic scene. It's just Simon bringing home guests for the Sabbath again. Nothing to see here. Really, nothing special. Just another easygoing evening of family and friends at home. Another Norman Rockwell painting, the Palestinian version. But of course, we all know there's nothing easy about family or home. Just because it's domestic doesn't mean it's domesticated. Quite the opposite. Rather, the personal is always political. That is, it's always about power and our relationship to power and our relationships to one another as we do the hard work of negotiating our life together. And the more personal the relationships, the more mundane the tasks, the more assumed the roles and rules are, the more political it all really is. The closer to home, the closer to home. And the same holds truth for our faith as well. I don't want you to get the wrong idea, but contrary to popular opinion, it's not our Sunday worship that matters most in the grand scheme of things, in the eyes of God, but rather our everyday relationships, our public actions and our private hearts the other 6 days of the week. In our Christian faith, in Jesus' eyes, there are no small roles, only small actors. Little men, little women like us, and little old ladies like Simon's mother-in-law. In our passage from Mark's Gospel today, Jesus arrives at the home of Simon and his brother Andrew, only to find Simon's mother-in-law trapped, unable to move, barely able to breathe, a woman only half alive. She also happens to have a terrible fever. Simon's mother-in-law is trapped in her role as Simon's mother-in-law in Simon's house in first century Palestine. She is a widow and a woman completely dependent on her son-in-law's largesse, trapped as a virtual slave in his house, beholden to his rules, expected to wait on him and his unannounced guests hand and foot. Now, you may say that's a lot to assume from just a scant couple of lines of biblical text. But you see, that's exactly the point. The author of the Gospel of Mark didn't have to say more about this woman because he could assume that everyone in his audience would already understand all of the above. They would already know all of these things about her. It's a given. She's a given in the story. Even in our modern English usage some 2,000 years later, this woman is little more than a butt of any one of countless number of cheap mother-in-law jokes. She's not a whole person. She's a prop in everyone else's story. And that's just how Jesus meets her, how Jesus first encounters her, lying abed in a grotesque caricature of Sabbath rest, burning up, wasting away. So without a word, Jesus extends his hand to her and touches her and gently lifts her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. Wait, what? That can't be it, right? That can't be the whole point of this story. That she is freed from her fever so she can go back to the daily grind of serving this household once again. Not after all that big personalist political buildup, right? That can't be what I mean. That Jesus heals this poor woman just so she can get back to work, back to the kitchen to make some supper for the menfolk, woman. No, right? I mean, no, just no. Jesus wouldn't do that, would he? Well, I think we would have every right to be outraged if he did, but I don't believe Jesus did that. I don't believe Jesus gave this woman back her life just so it could be taken away from her again, snatched away. I don't believe that's the point of this story. Again, sometimes it's not just the devil that's in the details, but God as well. God in the small stuff, in the everyday stuff, the domestic stuff, the quiet word, the gentle touch, the simple and not so simple human stuff of the story. I believe that when Jesus touches this woman and takes her hand and lifts her up, I believe that he raises her. He resurrects her even. Don't look at me that way. It's the same word used of Jesus' Easter resurrection in Mark 16 as it is here in Mark 1. He lifts her up. He raises her to new life, to her own life for once. With just a touch, Jesus heals her and releases her and restores her to her own whole and holy personhood as a beloved daughter of God. And then, having been given back herself freely, she can now choose how she will freely give herself away. Jesus restores her to her own agency. And from that place of personal and political power, past all the jokes and the roles and the rules and the expectations, this woman is finally able to choose for herself whom and how she will serve. It's a small but infinitely important distinction, I think. In the midst of a world that seeks to take so much from us, take and take and take from all of us, but especially from those who are allowed only to eke out their tiny, cramped lives on the margins, lives so rigidly regulated by the powers that be, by social and economic and cultural constraints. You see, the secret is that none of us are really as free as we think. Total personal individual freedom is a peculiarly American fiction. But still, constrained as we are in our choices, still, some of us are more free than others. Some of us are more free than Simon's mother-in-law, certainly. More free than the racial and religious and sexual minorities among us. Freer than the poor and the sick among us. Certainly more free than Jesus, who will be nailed to a cross at the almost end of this very gospel as a not so subtle reminder from the political and religious institutions of his day that they own him, that they have the power to give and take away his life at any time. But there is the crux right there. The gospel revolution begins when, despite all of that, in the face of all of the powers and principalities arrayed against him, Jesus owns his own life as a beloved child of God and asserts his calling and his personal political power and chooses for himself how he will spend his life in the world. Yes, the chief priests and the Roman authorities will determine the excruciating how of Jesus' death, but they cannot control the why and the wherefore of it. Only Jesus gets to decide that he will freely give his life in service to the liberating gospel good news of justice, peace, and compassion, which is meant to be a great joy for all the people. No matter who we are, no matter where we are on life's journey, no matter how big or small our roles in life, they cannot take that choice away from him. And they cannot take it away from this woman either, this nameless, faceless woman, half hidden in the folds of today's reading, because Jesus raises her up. Jesus lifts her from the tomb of other people's demands and expectations that keep her trapped. She is not free from relationships after Jesus, but restored to herself. She is free to choose how she will live those relationships out in her life. And she chooses to be more than just the butt of a joke, or a pair of hands cooking dinner or cleaning house. She chooses to be more than merely a disciple of Jesus, a learner like her son-in-law, Simon, and Andrew and James and John. No, restored to herself, she chooses a better way. She follows in Jesus' own footsteps as a deacon. The very model of a deacon. That's the word that's used here in the text. She is freed from her fever. She gets up and she deacons that whole house. She becomes a servant in the model of the servant Christ. A servant not of man or any men at all, but of God's kingdom. God's purposes of justice, peace, and compassion. Sure, her stage is small, but her calling, our calling, is large. A colleague this week reminded me of these words from author George Bernard Shaw in his dedication to his 1903 play, Man and Superman. He says, "This is the true joy in life. The being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. The being thoroughly worn out before you're thrown on the scrap heap. The being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. This woman is not complaining. She is claiming her life. She is not whining. She is winning. And as he did for her, so Jesus does for us. Jesus seeks us out and finds us where we are languishing, half alive in the midst of our lives. And he lifts us up. He raises us. He resurrects us to our right minds and our highest calling. Our calling to lift one another up. To be part of the truly free people who in turn free people. To be themselves, to know themselves. To know themselves to be beloved and to make their own choices in the midst of the constraints of this world in an imitation of Christ. Even God does not demand this calling from us, but invites us into this new life. Following in Christ's footsteps, we are free to give our lives if we choose. God calls and we are free to accept the calling. History does not remember this woman's name. But freed from her fever, you can bet she does. She knows her own name now, and she knows God does too. And now together we remember her gospel calling, both a reflection and a foretaste of our own. Thanks be to God.